You're listening to The People's Voice, June 1st to 15th, 2024. Ahead of the April 16th federal budget, polling company Ipsos surveyed 1,000 Canadians about their financial priorities. 44% of those polled cited their number one desire was for Ottawa to help curb the rising cost of living. The second highest priority was for increased investment in healthcare, and the fourth highest priority was for government action on housing. But sadly, concrete plans like rent control, minimum wage increases, or pharmacare programs are not reflected in the federal budget. Instead, the government offers wishy-washy plans that often involve the privatization of public facilities or services, gimmicky home buyer savings programs, or greater military spending. Over the next 5 years, official military spending in Canada will grow to around $50 billion per year. As Justin Trudeau recently said, we project we're heading up to 1.76% of GDP, and we know that there is more to come over the coming years as Canada continues to step up in a more uncertain and, quite frankly, more dangerous world. With people's desperate needs being displaced by militarism, the Communist Party of Canada is campaigning to cut Canada's military budget to $12.5 billion, a sufficient amount for national defense, but none for NATO wars, funding for regime change, or equipment for atrocities in Palestine, Ukraine, or Yemen. Throughout the month of May, the Ontario Health Coalition was engaged in a province-wide campaign to educate and mobilize people against the privatization of healthcare. Instead of expanding services in public hospitals, the Ford government has given hundreds of millions in public dollars to corporations to privatize healthcare. Ford promised that Ontarians would never have to pay for healthcare, but his government is letting private clinics get away with charges which are illegal under current Medicare laws. For example, Lois Cooper was charged nearly $8,000 by a for-profit clinic for eye surgery, even though the Canada Health Act forbids charging user fees for medically needed surgery. Cooper spoke out and shared her story on CBC News after hearing the Premier claim that private clinics would not charge patients extra fees. It feels like it's my public duty to say that's not true. While the Tories underfund public hospitals, they are paying a whopping premium for private for-profit facilities, with members of the Conservative Party reaping personal benefits, such as former Health Minister Christine Elliott, who went on to become a lobbyist for a corporation that owns a for-profit hospital. But this problem is only part of the Ford government's overall strategy of reducing public control over healthcare services and infrastructure. Further evidence of the Ford government's attempt to strain the public system can be seen in its systematic underspending on healthcare, with a total of $1.7 billion left over in the 2022 budget. In 2023, the government introduced Bill 60, which made sweeping structural changes to commodify health services and expand the power of private clinics, while imposing limited public oversight, standards, or regulations. Meanwhile, Ottawa is less interested in funding critical services like healthcare, education, and housing than it is at adding tens of billions to the already bloated military budget. Within this context, powerful corporations are keen to capitalize on the current crisis of a systematically gutted public healthcare system. Therefore, what is urgently needed is a mass struggle to compel governments to cut military spending and increase corporate taxes while funding, expanding, and maintaining universal public services. For years, the Ontario Health Coalition has been working with unions and local community groups to build and sustain just that kind of struggle. The On to Ottawa Peace Caravan, jointly sponsored by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, arrived in Ottawa the day before the city hosted the CanSec Military Arms Fair. The goal of the On to Ottawa Peace Caravan is to build a broadly based, Canada-wide movement to demand that the federal government stop spending billions of dollars on military and fossil fuels and divert such funds to urgent clean energy development and other social needs. Organizers say that they take their inspiration from many other cross-country caravans, from the unemployed men who rode the rails to Ottawa demanding bread and jobs, to the abortion caravan where hundreds of women gathered on Parliament Hill, to the Action Canada Network Caravan, which focused attention on NAFTA, Indigenous women who walked to Ottawa on the Walk for Justice campaign, to Gin Foon Wong's cross-country motorcycle ride to Ottawa to expose discrimination against early Chinese immigrants. Participants of the Caravan stopped in various Canadian cities to speak about how military spending deprives Canadians of the dollars that are needed for social spending, how young people are not seeing a future, and how social problems are widely left unaddressed. They also spoke about the inhumanity of war, the significance of Nakba Day, the struggle of the Palestinians against Israeli occupation, as well as the wars in Ukraine, West Asia, and Africa. Participants insisted that Canadians stand together with people around the world to call for peace, climate justice, and support for human rights. Anne John was employed by MGM Food Services to work at an A&W outlet at Vancouver's International Terminal, where for over a year and a half she consistently received positive feedback for her work. On April 4th, she and hundreds of workers at the Vancouver airport signed a petition to the CEO asking for a $25 an hour living wage for all airport workers. John's employer, MGM Food Services, discouraged their staff from signing the petition, and after holding a meeting where they learned that John had signed the petition and encouraged others to do so, decided to deny her entry at the start of her shift 2 weeks later, with managers telling her she was not a good fit for the company. The Vancouver Airport Authority is a certified living wage employer, meaning that the airport has publicly committed to paying wages that reflect the true cost of living in the community and that parents can earn what they need to support their families. The organization which certifies employers, Living Wage for Families BC, says that a living wage in the Metro Vancouver area is $25.68 per hour. Unite Here Local 40 says in a public statement that the only possible reason for firing John is her support for Vancouver airport workers and their demand for a living wage. The union has launched an online campaign calling for the airport authority to ensure that John is reinstated to her position and to cut ties with MGM Food Services. Today marks the 1-month anniversary of the student encampment movement, which started at Columbia University in New York City on April 7th, and quickly spread to hundreds of campuses across North America and around the world. In addition to the ongoing call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, students have now taken aim at their own institution's complicity in Israel's occupation of Palestine, and are calling for their universities to disclose and divest their financial ties with Israel and the arms trade. In Canada, students have set up encampments at 15 universities, with more likely in the works. The protests have been overwhelmingly peaceful, diverse, and united in their call. Like the students who came before them in May 1968 and the Vietnam War, today's students face repression and condemnation from administrators, politicians, the media, and police. But also like their forebearers, they are on the right side of history, and that's why workers should be supporting them. Despite shameful attempts to criminalize the students, they are speaking truth to power and raising legitimate questions about how their institutions invest their endowments and whether they're complicit in genocide. This is why politicians, as well as university administrators, have relied on the police to end the protests by force in places like the University of Calgary, the University of Alberta, or most recently, York University. The labor movement cannot stand by and let these outrageous attacks take place. It needs to show up, speak out, and back the students, because the forces attacking the students' rights are the same ones attacking workers' rights. The better world that students are fighting for, from Gaza to Turtle Island, is one that would benefit working people everywhere, and the more workers are part of that struggle, the sooner we can all win our collective demands. The US has dismissed China's call for a no first-use treaty on nuclear weapons, claiming it has reservations about China's sincerity. The US speculates that China has recently increased its number of nuclear warheads to over 500 and that it might have up to 1,000 by 2030, and is therefore purportedly skeptical regarding China's sincerity. The US says China refuses to engage in nuclear disarmament talks, but in reality, China has engaged in talks regarding the need for the US to reduce its outrageously large number of missiles and is now proposing a ban on the first use of nuclear weapons. China has already signed no first-use deals with other countries, such as India, and takes precaution to store its warheads and delivery systems separately in order to avoid the risk of accidental launches. The outright dismissal of China's proposal followed a major speech in which Biden announced tariffs of up to 100% on Chinese steel imports, as well as US military buildups off the coast of China in the name of protecting Taiwan, which is of course part of China itself. The tariffs would apply to government-subsidized Chinese steel, aluminum, solar cells, and electric vehicles, with additional tariffs on batteries, semiconductors, and various raw materials. Despite tangible steps taken by the People's Republic of China to de-escalate the growing prospect of nuclear war, the US continues to make baseless accusations regarding China's lack of sincerity. But over the long haul, jingoistic attacks on countries like China and Russia, and a refusal to reduce the threat of nuclear war will work against the interests of the US and everyone else on the planet. On May 10th, Statistics Canada reported that Canada's economy had added 90,000 new jobs in April. While this may sound like positive news, the Bank of Canada expressed disappointment because for the past 2 years, it has been trying desperately to drive up unemployment, arguing that this will soothe demand and cool inflation. In reality, however, the inflationary pressures of the last 2 years are not demand-driven, but rather supply-driven, which means that pressuring demand through interest rates will not drive down inflation, particularly in the short term. Reflecting on the jobs report, the Bank of Canada and chief economist from Canada's big banks mournfully indicated that the economy is clearly not rolling over, which would give pause to the Bank of Canada on potentially lowering interest rates. GDP growth has slowed to a crawl with 3 years of decline, bringing the growth rate to the lowest since 2016. Meanwhile, Canadian industrial output dropped below 80% in the fourth quarter of 2023 for only the fourth time this century, with over 600 companies filing for bankruptcy in June 2024 alone. While the economy may be adding jobs, unemployment is still ticking upward, reaching 6.1% across the country, and in large urban centers like Toronto, sitting at 7.7%, which has resulted in a 20% increase in employment insurance claims, a jump of almost 100,000 recipients across the country. Meanwhile, Canadian corporate profits have maintained staggering highs, totaling $577 billion in 2023, the same year inflation peaked at 8%. The reality is that corporate profits have long been shown to be the driving factor in growing inflation, but we can't expect the Bank of Canada or Parliament to fight a war against inflation because the real war is a class war, and the question before working people in Canada today is, what are we going to do about it? That's all for now. If you're interested in strengthening working class press here in Canada, consider lending your support to the People's Voice Fund Drive at pvonline.ca.